This gripping case shines a harrowing light on a tragedy that unfolded on June 29, 2025. A 20-year-old transient Wess Roley ignited a wildfire and then ambushed firefighters who arrived to contain it. But who was he? What drove him to such violence? This video dives into his past, psychological context, law enforcement, response, and the impact on the Coeur community, with exclusive details, compelling quotes, and a timeline. This is the definitive guide to understanding a complex, headline-grabbing case. When I first started digging into the story of Wess Roley, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off long before that wildfire in Idaho ever started. It's easy to look at the end of a story and think he just snapped, but the truth is, most stories like this have cracks way earlier, and in Wes's case, yeah, they were there. So, here's what I pieced together. Wess Roley was born around 2004, which would make him just 20 years old when everything went down. He spent his early years in California before moving to Arizona. Not much is publicly detailed about those years, but growing up between states like that, they usually signals some kind of instability. I've worked with youth groups long enough to know that kids in split households or bouncing around different homes often develop a weird sense of rootlessness. They don't know where they belong, and sometimes that turns into something darker. Now, what really caught my attention was what happened around 2015. That's when his parents divorced. Not unusual on its own. I mean, half of my friend group's parents split when we were kids, but the how of it matters. In Wes's case, court records show his mom filed a protection order, saying his dad had made violent threats. That's serious. Like, not just we don't get along, more like something's wrong here. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that what a kid sees conflict at home that intense, it can either make them shut down or start mimicking the behavior. Wes lived with his mom for several years after the divorce. There's not a lot out there about what their relationship was like, but by adolescence, it seems he started spending more time with his dad again, which makes you wonder what changed, or maybe nothing did, and Wes just drifted wherever felt more tolerable at the time. I don't know, but what I do know is that shifting loyalties between parents, especially in households with violence or emotional instability, can really mess with a kid's sense of self. I've seen teens go from honor roll to probation in a year, just trying to keep up with chaos at home. And then there's the move to Idaho. That part still feels like a blank space. I've heard theories. Some say he wanted to start over, others say he just kind of ended up there. But the fact that he was living out of his car later and tells me it wasn't exactly a clean break or fresh start. More like survival. Honestly, I don't think Wess Roley ever had a really shot of stability in between the cross-state living. His family tension, the divorce, and a protection order, it feels like the guy was carrying emotional weight before he ever hit high school. And when you combine that with isolation and zero support systems in adulthood, well, it's not an excuse for what happened, but it is part of the explanation. If there's a takeaway here, it's the early warning signs matter, and so does checking in, especially with kids who are quiet or seem fine on the surface, because sometimes those are the ones silently slipping through the cracks. This part of Wes Roley's story, honestly, it messed with me a bit because I've known people like him, the ones who are chasing something bigger than themselves, something with meaning, but can't seem to get their feet under them long enough to make it stick. That was Wes, a kid with messy roots, sure, but with this strange mix of ambition and unraveling right under the surface. Back in high school, Arizona, class of 2024, Wes was a track athlete. I found that detail almost by accident, buried in some report, and it made me pause. You don't just do track unless you've got some drive. I remember my cousin ran across country, and the discipline, waking up early, pushing through pain, dealing with coaches yelling at you, to push harder, even when your lungs feel like they're gonna burst. That takes grit. And the weird thing is, it often attracts people who are trying to prove something. to themselves or to everyone else. At some point after high school, he got a job doing tree service. If you've never worked with chainsaws and hides, let me just say that is not a lazy man's job. You're talking physical labor, hot sun, sore arms, blisters. It's hard work, but it's also kind of peaceful. There's a rhythm to it. A lot of guys I've met in that line of work find it therapeutic in a way, like it keeps their mind quiet. And according to multiple sources, West told people he wanted to be a firefighter someday. That's not something you just throw out there. It takes guts, and it's one of the most respected and grueling professions out there. But here's where it gets heartbreaking. Despite the job, despite the dreams, he was living out of his car. Think about that. Wanting to be a firefighter, someone who runs into danger, someone who saves lives, and not even having a bed to sleep in at night. That dissonance hits hard. I've met folks at shelters who had similar stories, working jobs, staying clean, trying to move up, but one bad break or missing support system, and boom, they're sleeping in parking lots or crashing at parks. We don't know exactly why he never made it to firefighter training. Maybe it was money, maybe it was mental health, or maybe it was the kind of quiet chaos that builds when you're always one step away from disaster. But what we do know is that he wasn't a total drifter. He had goals that makes this whole thing sting a little more. So yeah, it's complicated. Wess Roley wasn't just some violent guy living off grid. He ran track, he climbed trees, he talked about being a firefighter. And somewhere along the way, those hopes get swallowed by something darker. It's a tough reminder that not everyone who's struggling looks like it from the outside. I remember the moment I first heard about the Idaho firefighter ambush. It came through a news alert on my phone, and at first I thought it was a wildfire update. Then I saw the words ambush and firefighters in the same sentence, and my stomach dropped. I followed true crime for years, but something about this one felt personal. Maybe it's because I used to volunteer at a firehouse during college summers. Those guys don't carry guns. They don't go looking for danger, they show up to help. According to officials, it all went down on June 29, 2025. Wess Roley, the 20-year-old suspect, used a flint tool to spark a blaze on Canfield Mountain intentionally. The idea that someone would start a fire on purpose is chilling enough, but it gets worse. This wasn't just arson, it was a setup, and that part hit me like a gut punch. As someone who's hiked that kind of terrain before, I can tell you, once fire takes hold in dry mountain brush, it spreads fast. Fire crews were dispatched right away, doing what they do best, containing and controlling. When they arrived, Rolly was already parked there. They didn't even come at him aggressively. Reports say they simply asked him to move his car, since it was parked in the path of emergency vehicles. That's it, just a basic routine request. And then chaos. Wes opened fire. I can stop thinking about how fast it must have happened. 1 second you're trying to fight a fire, the next bullets are flying. Two of the victims were Battalion Chief Frank Harwood, 42 years old, and Battalion Chief John Morrison, who was 52. Both men had spent their lives saving others, and they died in a scenario no firefighter should ever have to prepare for. A third firefighter was critically injured but somehow survived. I don't know how, sheer luck, maybe. Or maybe the shooter hesitated. From a tactical standpoint, what West did was deliberate. He created a crisis to draw in targets. That's the kind of thing you usually only hear about in warfare or twisted revenge stories, not on a forest trail in northern Idaho. And here's what hurts the most. This wasn't a heat of the moment thing. This was a calculated ambush. From the moment he sparked that fire, it was all set in motion. The lives lost that day weren't random. They were taken in one of the most cold-blooded setups I've ever read about in a domestic case. I've talked to a few first responders since this happened, and the fear is real. They're rethinking safety. Some departments are asking whether wildland fire crews should be armed. That's how serious this was. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. I've covered a lot of high intensity situations over the years. Active shooter drills, manhunts, even a couple of cases where SWAT had to intervene in rural areas. But this one, the response to what West really did up on Canfield Mountain was something else entirely. You don't just get 300 plus officers thrown at a case unless the threat level is through the roof. And in this case, it absolutely was. Once shots were fired at the fire crew, the whole thing escalated. In seconds, first responders radioed in an active shooter. From there, it was like dominoes falling. Local deputies, state troopers, federal agencies, they all mobilized fast. Some were already nearby because of the wildfire, which might have saved even more lives, but it didn't stop there. Sniper teams were deployed. And yeah, I had to reread that part when I first saw it. Sniper helicopters in Idaho. That tells you just how unpredictable and dangerous they thought Rolly was. And I get it. You've got a young man who just gunned down firemen, possibly hiding somewhere in a mountain forest, potentially armed, and already shown he's willing to kill. You don't go in light. They used cell phone tracking to narrow his location. That kind of tech has saved lives, but it's eerie too. A ping here, a signal there, and suddenly hundreds of boots are closing in on one person. It was a full-blown tactical operation. SWAT officers were reportedly moving through dense terrain in full gear, with eyes in the sky and ground units working in coordinated waves. I can't even imagine the adrenaline pumping through the teams. Eventually, they found him. Wess Roley was dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound alone in the woods. It's such a jarring ending. After all that carnage, all that chaos, it ends not with a firefight, but with silence. That silence, I keep thinking about it. After the choppers, the shouting, the standoff tension, it just ended. And I'm torn. Honestly, part of me thinks it was better that way, no more lives lost, but another part wonders what answer we could have gotten if he had survived, why he did it, what was going through his head when he lit that fire, what broke inside him. Law enforcement said this was one of the largest manhunts in the region in years. And it makes sense. They didn't just respond to a shooter, they responded to a shockwave that shook a community to its core. And while they did their job, you could tell this one hit differently. It wasn't just about catching a killer, it was about restoring a sense of safety that someone like Wess Roley tried to steal. If there's one thing that still keeps me up about this case, it's the why. Why would a 20-year-old, someone who once dreamt of becoming a firefighter, suddenly turn around and ambush the very people he used to admire? It's the part that law enforcement couldn't give a straight answer on. And honestly, I get it. There was no manifesto, no social media rant, no "here's why I did it" letter tucked away in his car. Just silence. And sometimes, that silence is the loudest red flag of all. I read through statements from Kootenai Sheriff's Office, and even they seemed stumped. They said they didn't have a confirmed motive, but there were indicators, sign that something was seriously off mentally. You can't always diagnose someone after the fact, but when you stack up the clues from Wes's past, you start to see a pattern that's all too familiar. Let's rewind. Back in 2015, Wes's parents divorced. At first glance, that might seem like a footnote, but not in this case. His mother filed a protection order against his father, saying she feared for her safety and her son's. That's heavy stuff for an 11-year-old to live through. I've worked with teens who grew up in homes with violence, and I'm telling you, it sticks. Sometimes it comes out in anxiety or withdrawal, other times in aggression. And if there's no one helping you process that trauma, it just simmers. Wes's later years paint a picture of someone slipping through the cracks. He wasn't homeless in the stereotypical way, no cardboard sign, no shelter line, but he was what they call a car-dwelling transient. That's a phrase I hadn't really thought much about until this case. It means he had just enough to stay afloat, but not enough to feel secure. The level of instability messes with your head. Living in your vehicle means never truly sleeping, never really relaxing, always wondering if someone's going to knock on your window at 2 a.m. People in that situation often stop thinking long term. They live in a survival mode. Every decision is about today, not tomorrow. And over time, it wears you down. Your sense of reality can start to bend. There are mental health theories swirling. Maybe a psychological break, maybe something deeper that was never diagnosed. And you know what? That part hits too close to home. I've seen friends spiral and disappear from their own lives. And the scary part is, it can happen quietly. No headlines, no warnings, just a slow unraveling. We may never get a clear answer about Wess Roley's motive, but what's obvious is this: he was deeply unwell, and nobody saw it in time. Or maybe nobody knew what they were looking at. It's a painful reminder of how mental health, untreated trauma, and isolation can fester until something terrible happens. What happened in Coeur shook the whole town, and honestly, it rippled way beyond just Idaho. The day after the ambush, I remember scrolling through local coverage, and nearly every photo had the same thing in common: flags at half staff. It wasn't just symbolic, it felt like a gut level response. This was more than a tragedy, it was personal. Three respected battalion thieves murdered in broad daylight, in a job that's supposed to be about saving lives, not losing them. Locals came out in droves for vigils and memorials. I watched clips of families standing quietly, some clutching candles, others holding signs like "Thank you, firefighters," and "We'll never forget." It reminded me of the small town unity I grew up around. The kind where everyone shows up even if they didn't know the victims directly. That's what grief looks like in pieces like Coeur d'Alene. It's not loud, it's heavy and quiet and real. But it wasn't just the emotional blow that hit hard. It was the policy questions that came next. Within days, conversations started buzzing around firefighter safety protocols, especially for those working in wildland settings. And honestly, the discussion was long overdue. These crews walk into burning mountainsides without weapons, without backup, and often without any idea of who might be nearby. They're trained for fires, not ambushes, and this incident made that vulnerability terrifyingly clear. I spoke to someone from a small town fire crew out west, and they told me they're now retraining their teams on situational awareness. Some departments are even considering having law enforcement accompany them on certain calls, especially when fires happen in remote or unpatrolled areas. That says a lot. Firefighting used to mean danger from flames, not bullets, but now it's all on the table. There's also been a wave of tributes from other fire departments, gear laid out on station steps, helmet ceremonies, department-wide moments of silence, stuff that gives you chills when you see it. It wasn't performative. It was raw, because every firefighter who saw this story probably thought, that could have been me, that could have been us. And then there's the public, people who may have never thought twice about the dangers firefighters face are now wide awake to it. We're talking more community donations, more political voices calling for safety gear funding, and a bigger national spotlight on wildland firefighter vulnerability. It's one of those rare times when grief turned into advocacy almost overnight. What happened in Idaho wasn't just a crime scene, it was a turning point. And while the pain lingers, so that the conversation about safety, about trauma, and about how we protect the very people who run toward the flames when everyone else is running away. Even weeks after the shooting on Canfield Mountain, the questions haven't stopped, and honestly, they probably won't for a long time. The Kootenai County Sheriff's Office still hasn't released a final motive, and maybe they never will. Sometimes, the scariest part about cases like this is that there isn't a clean answer. No letter, no manifesto, just the fallout and a trail of grief. What we do know is that both local and federal agencies are deep into the review. I've seen this kind of interagency work before, and it usually means they're combing through everything: digital footprints, text messages, voice memos, surveillance logs, the whole nine yards. Everyone wants to know what they missed. If there was a warning sign, a conversation, something, because the idea that a 20-year-old could spiral this far without a single red flag being caught, that's haunting. There's also talk of doing a psychological autopsy, which, if you've never heard of that before, it's basically an attempt to piece together someone's mental health, mental state after death. Investigators will interview people who knew him, look through journal entries, if any, analyze behavior patterns. I've read case studies like that before, and they can be illuminating, painful, but illuminating. But here's the hard part. Even with all that digging, there is still a ton of unanswered questions. Was Wes already planning something like this months before? Or did it all happen in the final days leading up to the fire? Were there warning signs that friends or coworkers overlooked? Did he ever try to get help? And if he did, why didn't it stick? The investigation also raises big questions for first responder training. Should dispatch protocols change when fires are reported near known transient camps? Should mental health data be part of firefighter briefings? Within privacy limits, of course. There's this tension now between not overreacting and not ignoring red flags again. Everyone's walking a tightrope. And then there's just the ache of not knowing. For the families, for the community, for his former classmates, there's a real emotional cost in being left without answers. I don't know about you, but I'd rather hear a hard truth than live in a fog of we may never know. At the end of the day, this isn't just a criminal case, it's a collective reckoning. A young man who wanted to be a firefighter became the reason two firefighters were buried with honors. And until we understand how that shift happened, those open questions will hang in the air, heavy as smoke after wildfire. This case of Wess Roley, a troubled young man with firefighting dreams who became a tragic shooter, leaves many questions unanswered. With deep family trauma, sense of instability, and a bitter conclusion, the incident underscores the importance of mental health support, public safety awareness, and firefighter protection. Community healing continues as investigators piece together motive, while the public demands answers about prevention. Share this video to raise awareness about mental health warning signs and the need to protect first responders.